To webinar number 3 from the Educators School Safety Network. I'm Amanda Klinger.
And I'm Dr. Amy Klinger. Welcome.
And we're really glad that you could join us for our third webinar in this series. A little bit about who we are. We are a national nonprofit organization, and we provide school safety training and resources and technical assistance to schools throughout the United States and Canada. And in addition to that work, one of the things that we have is this series of online professional development opportunities. This is the third webinar, which means there is a webinar 1 and 2 floating out there that you can watch here on YouTube if that's where you are, or directly on our website. And we'll talk a little bit more at the end of the webinar about the other free online professional development opportunities that we have. Do you want to introduce yourself, Dr. Klinger?
I'm Dr. Amy Klinger. My background is in public education. That's one of the things that makes us a fairly unique nonprofit organization. I have 28 years of experience in public education as a teacher, a building level administrator, central office administrator, and college professor. So we definitely want to have a discussion today that is very practitioner based.
And I am Amanda Klinger. You can see from the Esquire, I am an attorney by training. I don't get too deep in the weeds with any of the attorney stuff, but I will make sure that I chime in with that as applicable. I am the Director of Operations for the Educators School Safety Network, and so I've been doing this kind of work, oh my gosh, for a really long time, since 2010. I did talk a little bit about the work that we do. What makes us really unique as an organization is being a nonprofit, number one, but number two, coming from an educational perspective. And I think that educational perspective is really, really critical across the spectrum of the work that we're doing in school safety, but especially on the topic that we're going to talk about today, the quote unquote softer side of school safety. Unfortunately, we see a lot of folks who sort of approach school safety as only these really hard measures, so security things, response, law enforcement type stuff, or emergency responder type stuff, and those things are important, but we do ourselves a disservice when we focus only on those things and then we never talk about school climate, school culture, the concerns that students have, the concerns that faculty and staff have. And so I think today we're going to try to marry those two sides of the house a little bit and talk about how some of those softer measures, or the things that we don't really necessarily always think of as school safety concerns, how they really can have a really big school safety impact.
So first, I apologize for the coughing. I'm coming off of a cold here, so hopefully I'll try to keep it down to a minimum. But I think it's important to start our conversation with talking about, here we are at the end of a week where we had another horrific school shooting. And it seems like, are we missing something that we're not talking about a tactical response, or we're not talking about active shooter response? Instead, we're talking about prevention and softer measures and climate and culture and support. Yeah, it is really important that we have those conversations about both sides of these things, because if we continue to do what we are doing and we're tone deaf to the implications of all of the other soft social emotional and all these other softer measures, we're not ever going to really get after the issues, not just of school shooting, but all the other hazards and potential violence that schools face. So if you're interested in seeing kind of an overview to sort of set the stage, in our previous webinars, we talked a little bit about violent threats and incidents in schools, and we used the report of the research that we've put out. So you may want to go back and sort of check those out for some of that foundational conversation about what's really happening in schools, how big of a problem is it, what are we up against, et cetera, et cetera. Because today we want to talk much more in generalities about what that means for kids. So if you want to, thank you, if you want to go to that, and then we'll sort of start with this whole notion about school safety not just being about active shooter response, but yet the way that we train, almost always the type of training that educators receive is focused very much on response to the most statistically rare event. And it's not typically predicated on prevention or on discussions of what are the things that we can do to provide supports and interventions. So a lot of things throughout this webinar, we're going to ask you to kind of reflect on. So I want you to start out by reflecting on, of these two options, which is more commonly implemented in your school? and which is more commonly implemented in schools across the United States. This sort of response, sort of notion of being reactive, active shooter response drills, lockdown drills, those sorts of things, or prevention measures like threat assessment and management. Well, we can tell you that unfortunately the least likely thing to happen in schools is the threat assessment and management part, and the most likely thing that students, teachers, and staff are subjected to is active shooter response drills. So we have taken a very heavy emphasis on response, not necessarily prevention.
Yeah.
Which begs a couple serious questions.
Yeah, and I think, here we're sort of talking about the dichotomy between active shooter response drills and sort of the strongest prevention you can undertake, which is, training up teams where you're doing threat assessment and management. But I think even, the prior slide where it talks about our active shooter, our training almost always is. Unfortunately, I think in this country, school safety has become synonymous with training and drills. And there is very little of an emphasis on, have we had a discussion about our procedures and our policies, and how would we need to change those? And so that is part of this concern is, can we move away from training and drills, and can we move towards some of these things that are more proactive, in addition to some of these prevention measures?
And we really divorced the notion of a comprehensive approach to school safety. We have taken a law enforcement perspective and said law enforcement is going to take care of this stuff, and then maybe counselors or psychologists can go over there and do the touchy-feely stuff over there, and then the rest of us are just going to kind of hope nothing happens.
Yep.
And so there are some very dire consequences when we over-rely on that law enforcement perspective for what can be an educational issue. And in addition to that horrific shooting this past week, we also saw a lot of notoriety and discussion about this particular event that occurred in Florida, where a deputy was charged. And again, we run into situations where we are taking folks with a law enforcement perspective who are used to dealing with criminals and perpetrators, and we're putting them into an educational setting without necessarily the appropriate support, training, mindset, whatever you want to call that. And we see, unfortunately, we see some of these sort of situations happening, and that's not to paint all law enforcement with a broad brush. Please don't misunderstand that. It's to say that we really need to be looking at this as an educational issue that requires law enforcement support.
Yes.
As opposed to a law enforcement issue where we say, somebody, law enforcement, you do something about this thing. And we'll just stand back and watch, as you saw in the video, where everyone stands back and watches, and the law enforcement individual applies a law enforcement metric to an educational situation. And our lawmakers exacerbate that by requiring things in legislation that are typically response-oriented, that are typically law enforcement-oriented, as opposed to softer measures that we know can prevent violence. So that's clearly an issue that we see really happening throughout the United States. And what we are hearing louder and louder from folks is that we are engaging in lockdown drills where the result is intimidation and trauma for kids and staff and students, not necessarily a higher level of preparedness or response, versus violence prevention measures where we find people feeling empowered, that I know what to do, I have the skills and capabilities, I can apply my educational skills as well as my school safety skills to this particular situation. And, sort of we've seen some extremes of that with the intimidation and trauma, and literally every day we see examples of it over and over and over. Probably the most dramatic one was the one from the spring. You want to talk about that one?
Yeah, and I think, we said earlier here about that this is what's required by law. And so no wonder active shooter response drills are happening much more often than violence prevention undertakings. And I think some of the reason that is in legislation is that it is considered easier to measure. It is easier to measure and to mandate, do this drill, as opposed to do this training and this undertaking and changing the way you do things. And we'll talk about climate and culture and how that can feel so ephemeral versus some of these things that feel like they're easier to measure. But, and we've talked about this in some of our prior webinars, in Colorado, they did an audit of all of their spending on all of these harder measures and things that were supposedly easier to track, and that why those were things that were required. And what did they find in that audit? We don't really have great data, and we can't really point to or indicate the efficacy of so many of these things that we did. So, which sort of begs the question then, must we continue to only mandate things that are harder measures? Can we not then provide supports and funding and mandates for some of these other things that are prevention? Because if we don't have great data on these things that were supposedly easy to track, then why couldn't we be doing some of the other ones? I think this is what you were sort of alluding to. This happened last March, in March of 2019, where they had some training in Indiana, and they had a number of teachers, who were talking about that they had been shot mock execution style with airsoft guns as part of a training. That is a training that did not empower those folks. That was traumatic, and it increased anxiety. And so we have to start looking at what are the unintended consequences of these things that we're undertaking. And in that same vein, we see a lot of concerns about, are we supporting our students? Are we doing things to support students, or are we surveilling them? Or have we gotten to the point where we feel like it is necessary to be surveilling students? And there is concern about the potential impact of some of these types of things that tend to treat our students more like inmates. Things like surveillance, searches, things like increased law enforcement and security presence. And again, as you said earlier, we're not saying that there isn't a role for law enforcement to be working collaboratively with educators. But when we just take our normal modalities of policing and we just place them on top of our school, there are consequences. There are consequences like what happened in Broward County, and there are intangible, there are non-violent consequences that are intangible and ephemeral, but those still exist as well.
And I think it's really important for us to say at this point, the whole notion of the support, not surveillance, that to a certain extent is in the eye of the beholder. A school administrator or a law enforcement guy or an SRO may not intend to do surveillance. Mm-hmm. They may feel we're doing this to keep kids safe, and we're being present, and we're making sure kids see that we're here. But there are unintended consequences and unintended ways mm-hmm. that perceive the things that we may do with very good intentions. Mm-hmm. So we can't just look at this and go, well, I didn't mean it that way, so therefore it didn't feel that way.
Right.
We don't know that.
Right.
And I think that's really important for our viewers to go back and sort of reflect on not what you intended, but how did the kids feel? Sure. Not what you thought you were doing, but what were you really doing? And I think that reflection is going to be key in this whole discussion.
Yeah, and especially in some communities, in marginalized communities where they have historically not had great relationships with the law enforcement, or they in their communities that have not had good interactions with law enforcement in the past. We can't just say, okay, throw law enforcement into the school and suspect that there won't be an impact. There's going to be an impact, and so we have to be really conscientious and strategic about that. In New York City, there was a student protest specifically about they were looking to spend additional money on surveillance, and the kids were, as part of their protest, counselors, not cops. We want support. We don't want surveillance, and so that is coming very strongly from students. And then the question is, what does the research say? A 2017 study in the Journal of Adolescent Health, students reported lower perceptions of safety when there were more cameras present inside the school. Lots of cameras inside, and this is from the study, made students feel that they were viewed as potential perpetrators who needed surveillance. So again, those cameras, I'm sure, were put in with really good intentions. We wanted to protect a kid from getting beat up outside of the locker room, or we wanted to have more eyes on things, and I'm sure that was well intentioned, but as you said, there are consequences which are maybe not aligned with what we initially intended. So do you want to talk a little bit about the reflection?
Yeah, so we want to challenge you a little bit throughout this webinar to kind of reflect on what that looks like in your school, what that means in your professional practice. So if you're not watching this live, you may want to pause the video at this point, and if not, come back and do this. But I'd like to challenge you to generate a list of all the things that you would call school safety related that have been happening in your school, whether it's initiatives that you've done, trainings, activities, policies, all the things that we have done in the name of school safety. over the last year or two, and label them. Maybe you want to make two columns. You want a response column, which is reactive, where this is about preparing to respond. And then you want a prevention column that's proactive. So go through and sort of label them as, are we spending most of our time, energy, money, resources on responding to incidents of violence, or are we spending equal amounts of time preventing them? So I would ask you to take a second and see what you find on that, and what are the implications of that. So if we are highly prepared for an active shooter event, but we're doing nothing to short circuit that or to prevent that, is that the best use of our resources that we have that we're allocating towards school safety? So let's start with that reflection. So probably the centerpiece of what we want to talk about today in these softer measures, and in a lot of our webinars and trainings, we talk about a lot of other violence prevention measures. We talk about strategic supervision and disclosures and all those sorts of things. But what we want to talk about today is something that you probably have looked at in your school to a certain extent, and that is, what is school climate and school culture, and what does that have to do with school safety? So if we look at Peterson's definition of school culture is the set of norms, values, beliefs, rituals, ceremonies, symbols, stories, all of those things that make up the persona of the school. And so he makes some really interesting observations about a healthy school culture. So we have this belief in the ability of our students to achieve success. We pass the belief on to others. We create policies and procedures and adopt practices that support that belief in the ability of every student. That is in a healthy culture. So if we think of a healthy approach to school safety, we're also looking at this belief that there is so much we can do, that we can prevent violence, that it's not just about being ready for the kid that's going to come into the school with a gun and shoot up the school. Instead, we create policies and procedures and practices that support what kids need, that work to be prepared, but also to prevent, so that a healthy school culture and a healthy school safety culture have those characteristics in common. Conversely, unfortunately, we have toxic school cultures where we believe that student success is based on whether the kid cares or not, how attentive they are, what their willingness to comply with what we say they should do. We create policies and procedures that support our belief in how impossible it is that everyone could achieve, and we just do the best we can, and what are we going to do? These are the kids that we're sent to. Now, to apply that to school safety, you can see where a toxic school safety culture is very much predicated on, there's nothing we can do, there's violence in our
Shooting,
world.
it just happened.
It's 2019, this is just the way it is now. And the only thing we could do would be to give every teacher a gun or to take all guns away. There's nothing we can do. We just have to do this constant practice for when that shooter comes in the building. That becomes a very toxic school safety culture as well. You want to connect that to anything? I don't want to interrupt you.
No, I think you talk about that feeling of like, how does this place feel? And we work nationally and we're in a lot of schools, and we have been in schools where from the moment you step inside, the people who are inhabiting that space, it's like, I'm just passing through. This place is I gotta put in my 4 years here. I just gotta put in my time. And there's staff and faculty who kind of act that way, and there's students who act that way.
And the dirty little secret is, if you have a toxic school culture, you probably have a toxic school safety culture that is predicated heavily on law enforcement, predicated heavily on surveillance, not support, predicated heavily on this is a thing that's going to happen and violence is inevitable, and we're not worried about prevention, we're worried about response. So I challenge you to go back and think about that. Where are we in that whole mix? Well, let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into looking at some of the differences between school climate and school culture, because you hear that bandied about a great deal. And so we tried to give you a lot of resources in this particular webinar that you may want to go and look at later. But take a look here from the National School Climate Council. The quality and character of school life as it relates to norms and values, interpersonal relations and social interactions, organizational processes and structures. That's a very sort of wordy definition, but it's the tone for all the learning and teaching that's done in the school. And it really has a significant impact on the way that kids are able to function within the school. And our school culture, in the words of the famous, very famous Roland Barthes, it's the way we do things around here. Now that can be positive or that can be negative, but that is the way that our culture is. It's the way we do things. And I think when we are trying to make that distinction between climate and culture, I think I've seen some really interesting analogies where they take it and they use that sort of weather analogy. So maybe if you want to go on to the next slide there with that table, let's take a little bit of a look at that. So I live in Northwest Ohio. So, our weather, if you will, is, in the summer it's kind of hot and humid, and then in the winter it gets cold and snowy. That is our weather in general. Now, sometimes in December we have very warm weather, and sometimes in December we have unusually harsh weather. So our culture is the way the weather typically is. Our climate is the weather today. So we have this unusual, whatever it is, it's an unusually warm day or whatever. So if you look at those two comparisons there, Monday versus Friday. On Monday, we have a very different climate of, oh, it's awful, it's Monday, I hate being back here. Friday, yay, the day's almost over, I can almost go home. But it is the culture that says Mondays are awful. And the climate is the way that we implement that. So you can kind of see, I think this table does a good job of sort of showing how climate and culture, while they are different things, they are so intertwined. And they are so intertwined in terms of safety as well. So I think that's really kind of an important thing. And when we look at the 12 dimensions of school climate that are measured, again, at the National School Climate Center, you can find lots of these different resources. But look where safety is, right there in those first three dimensions. The rules and norms, the sense of physical security, and the sense of social and emotional security. And then the interpersonal relationships down there, which are so closely intertwined as well. So there is a role for a conversation about school safety to loop in and to overlap with the conversation about school climate and culture. And that's very obvious there in what we're seeing in that work.
So we have some additional resources for you, and since you can't really click on the link here, I have all of the links are going to be in the video description. So you will be able to, all of the things that we talked about and the tables that we just showed and some of those different things, those are all linked in the description of this video.
So in this particular webinar, we're kind of giving you like a lot to reflect on, but we're also sending you out into the world to sort of gather together some of these different resources. But it's really important in your professional capacity to really have a good understanding of what school climate and culture, what does that mean for school safety, and what does it mean in general. So let's take a look at why school climate and school culture matters, because it matters in a variety of different ways. Number one, there is lots and lots, I could back up a dump truck of research that shows the impact that a positive school climate has, and conversely, the negative aspects of a toxic school climate. So when you have a positive school culture, you have improved student self-esteem. Typically, you have better, the students tend to be able to recover from self-criticism, have better sense of self, lower levels of drug use, fewer reports of psychiatric problems, better psychological well-being, lower absenteeism, and lower suspension. So all of these initiatives that you're thinking about in your school, that we need to get the kids here and we need to stop putting kids out of school, we need to start with our school culture to take a look at how to make inroads in those areas. Because there's lots and lots of research that indicates, just in general, a positive school climate results in healthier kids. There is also a direct impact on safety when we look at our school culture. So a positive school culture is associated with less aggressive behavior, less violent behavior, less bullying, less sexual harassment. And I think that it's really fascinating that a lot of our research over the past school year, for the 18-19 school year, really pointed at lots of concerns and incidents of really violent, aggressive behavior, not to the level of a school shooting, but aggressive behavior.
Like quotidian.
Anecdotally from teachers.
Yeah.
And we can see that school climate and culture has an impact on that.
And that's a you know, a correlation that you've seen for a long time. I mean, some of this research, the prior research was going back to 1978. So this isn't something that's just been in vogue recently that we've started studying with this, what we have perceived to be an influx in violence in our schools. This type of research has been studied for a really long time.
And it's very interesting that while we're going, wow, kids are getting more violent and aggressive, what can we do to stop it? I know, let's use law enforcement. Let's use law enforcement measures. Let's use security measures. Let's use surveillance. Let's use things that we would use, you know, against prisoners, as opposed to, let's check our climate and culture and see what's happening that's causing this violent and aggressive behavior. So, you know, maybe we're barking up the wrong tree here while we're seeing this incredible increase. Because as you said, Amanda, we've known for a long time that there are really incredible benefits to a positive climate and culture. And probably the most significant one is academic. It is directly related to increased academic performance at all levels, elementary, middle school, high school. So if you are sitting here going, we've got to get our scores up, then you need to look at your climate and culture. Because if you want to increase student academic achievement, you do a better job, you have a more positive school climate and culture. And that's, you know, those correlations are, as Amanda pointed out, over a long period of time with a lot of significant research that supports that.
And if you need to talk someone into that, and if you need to talk someone into that, which I wouldn't think that you would need to, but we do have additional resources for that. We have the research brief of the effects of school climate and culture on K-12 academic achievement, an interview with Peter DeWitt about the impact of climate and culture on student achievement, and those are all linked in the video description.
So let's kind of sum that up then. Are there any other impacts? Well, there is this quote that I really like: safe, caring, participatory, and responsive school climates foster a greater attachment to school. And when we look at one of the indicators that prevents violence, it is connectedness. It is that sense of belonging in school. It is that sense of this is a place that values me and that I value. And when we go back and look historically, and in the Secret Service report that has just come out on active shooting events, we see that disconnect. We see kids who are attacking schools who feel they are not attached there. They are not connected. They don't identify it. They see it as a place that has wronged them, that has hurt them, that is not safe, that is not caring, that they don't belong in. So this statement is so important. If there's no other reason that you're interested in climate and culture, this one I think really makes the case. So do you want to talk a little bit about some of these resources?
Yeah, so we have more resources to talk about. So we've told you why is it so important and shown you all of the evidence for that. But a couple of really good book resources, School Culture Rewired by Gruner and Whitaker. And we have a link in the video description to be able to purchase that book. And then Shaping School Culture by Deal and Peterson. Again, there's a link for that to be able to find that book, which is, I think they're on the 3rd edition now. That one's been out for quite a while.
I really recommend them. I think they're really good additions to your professional library that have nothing to do with school safety, but they also really support the work of school safety.
Okay, but I would disagree with you. They have nothing to do with school safety?
I mean, they have to do with a lot of things other than school safety. Maybe that's a better way to say it.
And then also, we have a PLC that we developed that has both a participant and a facilitator guide to do a professional learning community about improving school climate and culture, and then where we are obviously explicitly making that link between how can we address the concerns that we have about our school climate and culture, and what does that mean from a school safety standpoint. I think, in the Deal and Peterson book, for example, I don't think they specifically discuss school safety in that book, but there's a lot of interplay between those two. And I think in our PLC, we really make those connections. We really lay those bare and talk about those explicitly about those connections. And that's
I really need to advocate. I'm sorry. I just really need to advocate for a professional learning community approach to the examination of climate and culture, because it really is not a top-down notion. It is not need to get our principal, needs to fix our climate and culture. It really is a grassroots sort of thing, and it also requires a lot of reflection and analysis and discussion of how people feel, what people perceive, the way things are done, and so it's that collaboration in a professional learning community. Really, you get some really powerful insights, and it really is a catalyst to make those kind of changes, as opposed to we need someone to come and lecture to us for an hour and a half about climate and culture, and then it'll all be fixed. So I really advocate for you to do that that professional learning community approach, where you're collaborative and people are involved in the thoughtful discussion of that topic.
Yeah. So we have a link specifically to that in the video description, but you can see that's available on our website, on our marketplace webpage. And then this is another strategy brief that we have, and that's the link to this is also included in the video description.
And that'll give you some sort of foundational knowledge about how climate and culture is perceived, what the impact of it, those sort of things that we can't do in the brief time that we have together. But I do want to show you a couple of climate and culture inventories. There's tons of them out there. But I really like this particular one. But I wanted to show you the different aspects that it's really looking at. It's looking at professional collaboration, affiliative collegiality, self-determination, and then you sort of do a quick down and dirty, what is that, I keep doing math, 17 questions to really sort of starting to take the pulse of what's happening. And I like the idea of it being sort of a triage of like, what are the big issues here?
Yep.
And if you can kind of look at the way that you're asked to sort of reflect on that, these are all statements about our school. So as you work through this, I encourage you to not think about it in a vague sort of esoteric sense, but what's happening in our school about safety? What's happening in our school about supporting? Are we surveilling kids? What do our kids feel about the way that we're doing that? So imagine if you could do something like that, some sort of a assessment like that, if you will, about school safety that's related to that. So I'd like you to reflect on that for a minute. What would that look like, and what would our kids say if we did took this same sort of assessment approach to how they feel and whether they are feeling supported and so on? And Amanda, if you want to click ahead to the who owns what.
Well, I wanted to say one thing about this quick. When you talk about the triage, I think, sometimes we hear from folks that school climate and culture, like school safety, feels so overwhelming. That when people are in a school that has a toxic climate or culture, and they feel that, and they are able to tell, this is not great, something is wrong, but it feels so overwhelming of like, well, I don't know, school climate and culture takes years to fix. I think this triage survey is a really helpful one that you can go through in 17 questions and go, okay, there's 3 sections here, and we were okay in 2 of these, but this one section, oh my goodness, we were really, really struggling there. And I think that's there's other metrics that we look at, and there's a lot of other questionnaires that you can do, but I think this triage one is a really good part to go, where do we really need to focus our effort, and where do we really need to make a deep dive on improving our school culture? So
in that reflection, there you go, that's what I was looking for. I really like this idea of who owns what. And you can see this example there. You have across the top.
And when you say who owns it, you're asking, what is the perception of whose problem is that, right?
And I think the perception of, so I'm taking this inventory as a teacher. As a teacher, who do I think owns the problem of a student being tardy for school? Do I think that that's the student's problem, the parent's problem, the teacher's problem, the administrator's problem? And so I think there's a couple of really interesting ways to look at that. So if we took this, we talk about students being tardy for school versus tardy for class. Different people may own that. that doesn't mean that they're at fault. That means that they own that in terms of, I have a vested interest in this, and I'm part of the solution to that. Well, what if we erased all of these 18 different ones and we put in school safety related things? So a door that's propped open, who owns that? A student who is acting very withdrawn compared to the way they were a month ago, who owns that?
Mm-hmm.
A parent who seems really depressed and very aggressive in their demeanor, who owns that in terms of our response to that and what we do about that and the way that we approach that. And so I think that's just a really interesting way to kind of flip the script a little bit. Instead of working from this assumption that school safety trickles down to me, maybe, as opposed to there are things that students own, parents own, teachers own, administrators own, that really encompass all different aspects of school safety. What are your thoughts about that, coming from that perspective?
Yeah, and I think, we talk a lot about, in our training, we talk a lot about that we're looking for a decentralized approach, right? Everyone has a role to play when we're talking about school safety. And I think sometimes folks will take that very literally, and we do also mean that literally, that we can't, if we're responding to an event, we can't have only the principal on the radio barking orders, you go here, that people will need to be self-determined in a response. But really, when we're talking about everyone has a role to play, we are looking at that in a much more global sense. School safety cannot be just the problem of the administrator or the person at the district whose job it is, whose school safety is in their job title or their job description. I teach, when I teach some of the school safety courses at the university level, and I have students go and look at the emergency operations plan for their district. Unfortunately, about 30% of my students will say, I didn't know this plan existed, and there's a lot of great information in there. Well, if we only have things being a top-down approach, and the only person who owns school safety at an individual school level is the administrator, no wonder you have a lot of folks who don't know anything about that. And so we're really...
That's a critical question to ask. Who owns the problem that no one knows that there's a crisis plan?
Yeah.
Who owns that problem?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think, we need to look at, is there a discrepancy between what your leadership thinks everyone knows as far as their responsibilities or their capabilities or the tools that they would have at their disposal in a crisis event, and what's the discrepancy between what those folks think and what the third grade teachers know. And if the superintendents think that the third grade teachers know something that third grade teachers don't know, we have a real problem on our hands, and that's very common.
Could make the argument that you could ask two questions: who knows that, and who owns that?
Yeah.
Because really, there's two different problems inherent, perhaps, in each one of those things.
Yeah.
Really good point. Well, so using that sort of idea, I would encourage you to examine some of these sample questions. You've seen some of them, and they're available to you, and think about how would our staff, our students, and our parents answer some of these questions, and what are the implications, both in terms of the ones about culture, but more specifically the ones about school safety. So let's take a minute to look at what are some of the things that we maybe would be asking. So one of them is really looking at that notion of, what does a relationship-based culture look like? So if we were saying, who owns the idea of having a relationship-based culture? Well, what does that even look like? Because that's one of the critical parts of violence prevention. It's a critical part of a positive climate and culture, is a relationship-based culture that has a number of specific attributes. So let's take a look at them, just to kind of give you an idea of where we are with that.
And so
it's something we say, it's something we do.
So I would say this first picture here, now I realize it's a snapshot in time, but if that is what lunch looks like for the whole lunch period, is that a relationship-based culture? And then maybe the more uncomfortable question is that what lunch looks like in your school?
But let's be explicit here. Clearly we see kids who are sitting and talking to each other. So maybe there is a somewhat positive relationship-based culture. We don't have a kid sitting by themselves, maybe. But I think what Amanda's trying to call attention to is, you have a teacher who is not particularly involved or engaged in this particular instance. And that kind of takes us to one of the first attributes: significant, engaged presence of adults. So it's very important in a relationship-based culture that it's not just the presence, like there's someone with a pulse standing there, but rather that they are engaged and that they are significant adults.
Mm-hmm.
They are teachers and staff. They are people that the kids come in contact with and have interactions with and feel a stake or a connectedness with those individuals.
And the other side of that is potentially adults standing in groups, which, what's the problem? Adults standing in groups, that can discourage interactions and it can discourage disclosures. You can see in this picture, you have the two adults standing there talking with each other, and it looks like maybe a student who is wanting to talk to one of them, the kid in the gray sweatshirt, maybe he wants to talk to them and is feeling a little bit on the outside of a discussion that's already happening with two adults.
And we hear this all the time. Those two adults would tell us, well, I wasn't doing that on purpose. I'm more than willing to talk to that child. I'm more than willing to talk to that kid. I just needed to talk to Bob and we needed to plan what we were doing in third period. This is that unintended consequence. We see this all the time when we go into schools, where the teachers will tell us, I'm there for my students. I'm available. I want them to come talk to me if they have a problem. And then we watch those same students stand in the hallway with a group of 2 or 3 or 4 teachers and become completely inaccessible to kids. Or better yet, worse yet, they're not even in the hallway. They're not even available to kids. So it's that unintentional sort of thing. And this is probably, I think in 2019, the one that is probably the most problematic that people don't even realize, and that's, I've got my face in a screen. Is he available to students? Yeah. Is he accessible to them? Not necessarily. And so that's really important for us to be able to, and someone could make the argument, well, if the kid needs to talk to me, they'll just walk up and they'll just interrupt me. Right, unless it's something that I'm not really feeling very comfortable about talking to you with, and I'm feeling like I don't really want to draw attention to this. So it's really putting a barrier there between that relationship that we would have as student and teacher.
And I think it's important, that I think sometimes we fall into a sense of false complacency that I'm there, I'm physically present. So yes, if one of those students had a seizure, that adult is right there and they are physically present. But if we're talking about a relationship-based culture, and those of you, it's 2019, those of you out there listening can think about, how do my screens impact my relationships in my personal life? If I'm sitting at dinner with my significant other and we're both on our phones, that's impacting our relationship. And so this person is physically present, yes, but when we're talking about a relationship-based culture, especially when there's a power dynamic between an adult and a student, there's an impact. That screen has an impact.
Yeah. And then I want to go back to this one. And that's really, this one sometimes is a little ouchy for people, but it is really important in a relationship-based culture for staff and important adults to be present outside of those traditional times and outside of those traditional areas. So if I'm the math teacher and you know that you will find me standing outside my door in between classes, I don't show up till school starts, I leave as soon as school is over, the only place you can find me is in front of my door. As a math teacher, I can claim that I have a relationship with my students, and maybe I do. But could there be a more powerful, a more viable relationship if I am occasionally walking through the cafeteria, if I'm stopping into volleyball practice, if I'm walking out the door after school and I'm available to stop and help a kid with a problem, a math problem, as he's sitting in the cafeteria in the after school program. So having staff who are present in ways beyond the confines of my school day and my subject area and my little corner of the world really goes a long way to establish those relationships with kids.
And I think that speaks to the concern of you don't know what you don't know. So if you are that teacher who is there during the traditional times and during my class period, and you have a few students that come up to you and you have a relationship with them, you can sort of lull yourself into a false sense of, I'm available to students, kids come up and talk to me. There are some kids, sort of like when I was in high school, where there are some kids who will talk to you no matter how unavailable you are. There's some kids who are going to come and talk to you. And the question is, am I available and am I accessible to those kids who are maybe a little bit more hesitant and are a little bit more shy and are a little bit more soft-spoken? And what those non-traditional, those unstructured times, a kid that maybe isn't going to stay after class and talk to me, or maybe isn't going to raise their hand and maybe isn't going to interrupt me, but if I'm there at a non-traditional or an unstructured time, that maybe they would feel more comfortable doing that.
Now, wait a minute. What's that? Oh, I can hear our viewers going, hold up. I'm not coming in at 6:30 in the morning and I'm not staying until 6 o'clock at night. I have a life. What do you want from me? I'm busy. I'm teaching all these preps. I get all that. It is not that difficult to do what we're talking about here within the confines of what you're doing. So when I get to school just in time, instead of standing at the copier, maybe I'm standing in the lobby where the kids are coming in off the buses. When I'm going down for my planning period, I'm going to walk a different way so that I'm visible in different hallways, so that I run into kids in different situations.
Mm-hmm.
When I go to get my lunch, rather than go in through the back door of the kitchen, I'm going to go through the cafeteria and take a look at the kids and have a brief conversation here and there with them. At the end of the day, maybe I'm going to say goodbye standing at the end of the hallway in the stairwell instead of in front of my room. So when we mix it up a little bit, even within the confines of our really closely crowded day, we suddenly become available to kids in different situations and different times than the status quo of I'm always in this 18 inches in front of my classroom door. So it can be done, and it's really important to do so, and it's really worth it.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about that. We know that a relationship-based culture, our staff is engaged with students in really strategic, deliberate ways. It's not just, well, it'll happen. So, if we want to have a relationship-based culture, I'll just smile at all the kids, and then we'll have a relationship.
Think about it.
I'm sorry?
I'll just think really strongly about my relationships with students.
Or I'll think fondly of them.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Then it'll be a relationship-based
Yeah.
culture. But there are some really deliberate practices. One of them is supervision. And again, no one's super into that, but we can do that in some of the ways we talked about, of being present and where we're moving through the building. Mentoring is another one that's really important, where I'm taking that few minutes of extra time.
And informal mentoring.
I'm sorry?
And we're talking also about informal mentoring.
Yeah.
It does not mean that I'm mentoring you for your career and blah, blah. Informal mentoring of like having these informal human personal relationships with students.
I read a study, and I can't come up with it off the top of my head, but I read a study about some kids who were really so disconnected from school. And they followed some of these kids around, and what they found was some of these kids had not a single positive interaction the entire day. So the only time anyone spoke to them was when they were getting in trouble for something, or when they were being told to do something. There were kids that went the entire day with no one greeting them and just saying hi, or hey, did you see the game last night? Or, oh, I like your shirt. There were kids that had not one single positive interaction. And if there were a way to do it, I would encourage all of us to take kids in our school and track them in that way and walk in their shoes and go, it's Monday, I was there the whole day. How many times did anyone ask how I was, or what I did over the weekend, or did I watch some particular show? And I think that mentoring, we think it's so formalized, when it's really, in many cases, just having a positive interaction. And then another deliberate practice is the whole idea of observation. And that is not surveillance, that's observation. Paying attention to what's happening, watching kids, watching that dynamic, watching, body language and facial expression, and who's talking to whom, and who's alone, and who seems isolated, and who seems withdrawn compared to the way that they used to be. some sort of observation where we're immersed in what the kids are doing, we're listening, we're paying attention, and we're watching what's happening. Not in a I'm going to catch you doing something way, but in an observation way of, are you okay? What can I do? What can we talk about? What do you want to confide? Those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So if you want to go into our little reflection here, so if I were a student in your school and I think I heard someone threaten suicide today, who do I tell and how? And what are the obstacles to me finding someone to confide in? And we hear this all the time from teachers of, oh, well, we would tell the kids to just go tell us. Think sometimes about how many people I would have to walk by who were talking to somebody else on the phone, in a screen, who yelled at me to get to class, the bus driver told me to get off the bus, the secretary told me to go out to get to class. Think of all of those different interactions where we don't know what it is the student is trying to disclose or what kind of a relationship they're trying to connect, how they're trying to interact with me,
and
because we're kind of doing business as usual.
And keep in mind what we have here of someone, they think they heard someone.
Yeah.
They didn't see someone who was actively harming themselves. They thought maybe I heard that, and they are internally conflicted of, is this even my business? Who I shouldn't say, we don't rat out our friends. So you have to keep in mind that, you know, the students who are very vigorous in their convictions and are very outgoing and they know that they for sure saw something that was a real emergency, yeah, those kids are going to tell us. What we're trying to cast a wider net. Who are the kids that are a little nervous about saying something and I'm not really sure what I heard and it's not really my business and my parents tell me to mind my own business, and you know, think of the kids who are really you know, kind of chewed up about some of this stuff.
Well, and Amanda, in your interview that you did a couple of weeks ago, you talked about the idea of how we are outsourcing a lot of our relationship and emotional labor to technology.
Yeah.
So, you know, we just talked in our last podcast about how I want to go to the restroom, so I enter in on my laptop a request to go to the bathroom as opposed to talking to the teacher at the front of the room.
Yeah.
Or, you know, all of these different instances where I'm just going to call the tip line, or I'm going to do the state level tip line. And so we're giving away these opportunities to have relationship based interactions. And that's a very dangerous notion when we're missing a lot of the things that are not going to rise to the level of a slam dunk. I got to call the tip line. I got to call 911. I got to tell the police. We're missing all these gray areas where kids are concerned, but not sure what to do about it.
And what is the unintended message? If I say, if you want to go to the bathroom, punch it in on the keypad and it'll pop up to me. What I'm saying is my interaction with you is not very important. And so having a tip line can be really helpful and it can be a really good tool to support this work. But if the only thing we have is tell it to the tip line, tell it to the tip line, what I am unintentionally telling kids is it's not important for me to hear that, tell it to the tip line. And, you know, if we're outsourcing, you know, the ordering at McDonald's, that interpersonal, I mean, you could argue, you could debate whether that interpersonal relationship at McDonald's is really valuable in and of itself. But I know for sure that interpersonal relationship between a student and a teacher is valuable in and of itself. We are not just trying to get information as quickly as possible into our database. There is value in that interaction and in that disclosure happening to a person.
So I, again, encourage you to go back and take a look at some of those relationship-based sort of things. And it's a buzzword. Everyone goes, oh, yeah, we have a relationship-based culture. Oh, yeah, my kids would tell me anything. We've got the litany of violent events historically over the past 20 years that indicate kids are not telling us.
Yeah.
So please don't be the school that goes, we'd know, because you wouldn't.
Yeah.
So why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about probably our favorite support or soft measure in talking about threat assessment.
Sure. So the question, why, as always, why engage with threat assessment? And the Department of Education explicitly says it's one of the most useful tools a school can develop, a multidisciplinary school threat assessment team. It's a fact-based investigative approach to determine how likely someone is to carry out a threat of violence And it's when we are identifying, assessing, and managing individuals who may pose a threat. And that manage part is interventions to reduce risk. So this is what the three main jobs of the threat assessment team. They're identifying who do we need to be concerned about, they're assessing how concerned do I need to be, and then most importantly, we're managing. How do we provide supports and interventions to individuals of concern? And the central question in threat assessment is we are balancing these two competing interests. A student has the right to a free and appropriate public education, and everyone else has a right to be safe. So a student doesn't have an absolute unqualified right to stay in school if everyone else cannot be safe as a result. And so we're trying to balance those two. And it's not that we're going to kick kids out of school as a result. It's how can we keep this kid here safely? And sometimes we can't. And sometimes we need to have a separate facility placement. But the central question is balancing these two competing aims.
And we don't make a lot of unilateral statements, but I will about threat assessment. If you don't have one, you should.
Mm-hmm.
It is a critical activity that every school should have.
Yep.
So I encourage you to go to our website. We have a number of resources related to threat assessment management. Do a little bit of professional development on that and really start to learn about that, because that is probably one of the most, well, you saw that verbiage. That's one of the most underutilized things that absolutely need to occur in schools. So one of the things that's kind of an outgrowth of threat assessment is the idea of putting in place appropriate supports and interventions. And we hear a lot of discussion about that in terms of what we see happening in schools and the way that schools are approaching this work. So we try to put together a little bit of a discussion, if you will, or a little bit of a tip on what do some of these supports and interventions look like. There is a tip sheet on our website that we've put together that correlates the idea of the manage part from threat assessment management, and looks at how do we put together appropriate supports and interventions when we are doing threat assessment on a kid who is at risk for violence against themselves or others. So it's not just about active shooter, it's all of these different potential implications. So we want to just very quickly wrap up the webinar today by looking a little bit at some of those in anticipation of the fact that you can go get these, but we also want to talk about them real quickly.
Yeah, you have to go real quickly.
I think the major thing is we want to make sure that the intervention that we're doing really supports the specific needs and issues of the student. That's going to be a critical piece. We want to make sure that we are focusing on interactions and relationships. That's the next one. You can move on there. There you go. We want to focus on relationships and interactions over punishment. So supports and interventions are not consequences. You already have those. It's really important, however, that we do hold the individual accountable. So when we are putting in appropriate supports and interventions, there are consequences. So we want to do both holding them accountable, but also providing that support. We want to make sure that our management plans are comprehensive, that they're consistent, and that they're flexible. We don't want to use a one-size-fits-all approach for all students. So that's a really critical.
And it's important that when we say consistency, it doesn't mean that no matter what you do, these are our supports and interventions, and we do those. And that said in the very first one, what we're doing needs to be tailored to the needs of the individual. So we do need to have consistency, and we do need to have consequences, but we need to tailor these supports and interventions to the needs of the student.
And some examples, there's conflict resolution strategies, that's one. There's daily check-ins, I already talked about that, of kids having positive interactions. There's those mentorships that we talked about. Those are really powerful interventions and support. There's assigning kids duties and responsibilities to allow them a sense of ownership, a sense of belonging. And that one, frankly, is underutilized and is really, really powerful. So I would highly recommend looking at that one as well. So those are ones like even that have specific time periods attached. Like lunch is often problematic. So we're going to maybe implement strategies there. We're going to do things for their academic support. And that's typically done pretty successfully in schools. So that's certainly a piece of what we want to do. We may also want to implement some no contact agreements, getting them out of situations that are going to be problematic. As part of that accountability, we may want to do restitution or give students the opportunity to work on things to make it right. So our supports and interventions cannot just be, this is a punishment that we do, or this is a thing that we do. We have one thing, it's this, tutoring program or whatever it might be, but rather we have a cadre of things that we can choose from. So it's really important to kind of work on developing those as you implement those supports and interventions. And then finally, another soft measure that we want to kind of just touch on to give you some thoughts, but we're not going to spend much time on it, is the whole idea of communication and collaboration with parents. So I'm going to raise these final questions for you. Why are we so afraid to communicate with parents about school safety? Parents are the most invested in that. And in our work, we work with parent groups a lot and parent organizations, and they are very, very open and receptive and grateful for interactions and understanding what's happening with their kids in school. Parents are very significant advocates for us in schools to get us the safety resources and support that we need. And also think about, do we need to provide professional development support, helping them to understand what it is that we're doing. So when we talk about the softer side, we've been mostly focusing on students and educator interactions, but we need to also keep in mind that parents, that relationship with parents is also a significant part of our climate and culture as well. So we didn't answer lots of questions, but hopefully we gave you a lot of food for thought. So again, we always ask the question in every webinar, where do we go from here? But there is so much that we can do. And I think if you reflect back on what Amanda said earlier, if we say we want to do a massive overhaul of climate and culture, it is overwhelming. But just doing one of the reflection things that we talked about, or just thinking about one aspect of what we do, is really the first step. And so it's not an overwhelming notion if we do that a little bit at a time. The problem comes when we don't start. So really our takeaway from the webinar today is to really be a catalyst for some conversations that need to occur in your school.
Yeah. So is there someone that you wish had seen this webinar? Those of you who are joining us live and you have a colleague that wasn't joining us live and you wish that they had seen it, you can watch the archive. You can find it directly at our website, eschoolsafety.org/webinar. If you need proof of participation for this webinar, you can get that from us on that same webinar page on our website. We talked at the beginning a little bit about all of the online professional development that we have available for free. We have webinars like these. We have our live stream events, which happen pretty much every week. We also have the podcast where you can find anywhere that you normally get your podcasts. And if you're having a hard time, those links are directly on our website. We do have our last webinar of 2019. A potentially uncomfortable self-assessment. Again, it's that thing, you don't know what you don't know. And so in this webinar, we're going to sort of pose some of those questions of, have you considered this? Is this potentially an area where your school needs to improve? And is this a concern in your school? And, we will never improve our school safety in a school by going, yep, we have it all figured out. We did it. We're probably good. It's probably fine. We have to have those hard looks at what we're doing in the room for improvement, because we're not looking for perfection. We are looking for continuous improvement in the way that we approach school safety in our schools. I said earlier about signing up for the newsletter. You can pause this quick and scan that QR code. You can also go to that, really easy to type in, but if you go to our website, you'll be able to find out how to sign up for the newsletter. You can always look for our book. We published a book with ASCD that is, we're talking about a comprehensive all hazards approach to school safety, and we do talk about school climate and culture some in the book, so that's a good resource to check out. And you can always connect with us in all of these different ways. These are all of our different handles and social media things. So unless you have anything else to add?
No, we made the case for collaboration today and a relationship-based culture. Connect with us, collaborate with us.
Yeah.
Let us help you as you work on this really critical endeavor. It's important, but it's worth it.
So that's all we have for now, and until next time, thanks.
Thank you.